Good morning to you, ma'am.
Hello, Keith. This is Ilea Butler, and I am a social justice and human rights major, pre-law major at Arizona State University, former community organizer here in Kansas City, and I'm back in the area for a while, and I'm happy to be interviewing you about Malcolm X's 100th birthday celebration and issues that we're still struggling with in the community. So thank you.
And we're glad to have you on. Let's go ahead and get into the questions. We're trying to explain to people why we need to have this celebration on this particular birthday of Malcolm X. It's his 100th birthday. And I think it's a special occasion that needs to be given the recognition that it's worthy of. So what is your first question?
Absolutely, yes. I want to know what do you think Malcolm X would say about the current state of civil rights and social justice in the United States?
Well, if you mean social injustice, I think he would have plenty to say. But I think, or let me say that I know that he would be very disappointed because, I mean, we should be further along than we are right now in our struggle to end injustice and for civil rights. And we still got a long way to go before we can try to overcome some of the injustices that we've been victim of for so many years. And even while we are struggling to do that, our enemies are working day and night to try to take back many of the gains that we have already made. And right now they seem to be having a lot of success. What's your opinion about it?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think Malcolm would be disappointed. I think he'd be disappointed in the African American community because we have to keep it going. Like you said, the opposition is steady working day and night to overcome any gains that we've made, especially during the civil rights movement. A clear illustration of the opposition working against us was, the recent Roe v. Wade decision, right? So we know they've been working on that for 50 years, and we thought things were good, I guess. But it's the same thing here. We have to stay vigilant. We have to be the ones to ensure that our rights are being protected, and we do that by enforcing the laws ourselves. So, yes, I think we've got a long way to go. But with that in mind, how do you think we could best honor Malcolm X's legacy in society today?
Well, I think there's something in Malcolm X's life that everybody that's in the kind of position that we in or the predicament that we in can identify with. And I would say that the best way to honor his legacy is to study his life and take whatever parts of his life that you can identify with and make that a part of your life. Do like the children did in the movie Spike Lee's Malcolm X at the end. Stand up and tell the world, my name is Malcolm X. Because that's where we at. We have to take the examples that have been set before us. And not only with just Malcolm, but I mean, Malcolm can be a start. But we have to take the examples that were put out before us to follow because that's the best way for us to get where we need to go.
Yes, I agree with that 100%. I mean, we stand on the shoulders of some incredible giants, and I think to not look at their legacy and honor that is just something we can't allow to happen. You said study parts of his life. It took a long time for me to get to where I actually read his autobiography, and I learned so many things about him. And, when you read the story of his life, you see that Malcolm was a person who was a complete character. Like he changed from being in jail for burglary to becoming one of our greatest giants. And I think we have to really understand that even within ourselves, that we can find where we might have been parallel to his legacy. Maybe you're a criminal, you're a felon, you've had issues in your life. That doesn't mean that you can't turn yourself around. That doesn't mean that you can't educate yourself. And that was something that Malcolm was incredibly a huge advocate for. So I think we honor him by just continuing to work towards Black liberation.
So I'd also like to add that I became familiar with Malcolm X years. I mean, it was probably maybe right when he was assassinated. I didn't know anything about Malcolm while he was alive. But after he was assassinated, then, you kept hearing his name on the news all the time and things of this nature. And I'm like, who is this guy? Let me find out what he's about. And I was in the library one time and I was browsing through some material. And back then they had these old record players with these LPs which you could check out that had different lectures on them and stuff. And I pulled some of Malcolm's stuff off the shelf, and I started listening to him, and a lot of the things he was saying made a lot of sense to me. Now, I didn't get into his ideology as deeply as I should have probably back then because I was still kind of young. But I ended up in prison later on. And by the time I got to prison, I knew who he was. And then for some reason or another, I was always attracted and drawn to the guys in the prison environment that were into the militant thing. I didn't try to too much identify with the other guys that was into the madness and the craziness. I thought that I might could learn something hanging around with these guys. This guy gave me this Malcolm X's autobiography. And we got in some kind of dispute about something. He said, "Here, man, I want you to read this book." Because that was the only way it was going to be settled. And I'm looking at him like, I said, okay, but I'm like, man, I ain't finna read all that. And so I took the book. He kept, every time he see me, like, man, you reading that book? I said, yeah, man, I'm reading it. And I wasn't doing it. He said, man, read that book. And this is kind of like big guy, big muscle bound guy, lift weights and all that type of stuff. So I'm like, yeah, I better go on and read this book so I can give it on back to this guy so we don't forward this go somewhere it don't need to go. And so I started reading a few pages of it every day. But Malcolm X, when I got into his autobiography, that changed my life. I began to see Malcolm's life was more like my life.
Yes.
I could identify with people like Nelson Mandela. I could identify with Martin Luther King. I could identify with James Baldwin. I could identify with Stokely Carmichael, Prophet Noble Ali, Prophet Muhammad. I even became a Muslim. But out of all these people, Malcolm was the person that had more in common with me, or I had more in common with him than any of these other people that I recognize as leaders and people who could address the problems that black people had, because Malcolm he went through it all.
Right.
He actually had 3 phases in his life. First, he was a street hustler. He was a gangster and a pimp and all this other nonsense. Then he went to prison. He got converted to the Nation of Islam. And then he left the Nation of Islam after he made his pilgrimage to Mecca, and he got an opportunity to see what real Islam was about, how it was practiced in the East. So those are 3 phases of his life. And, a lot of people, they're more familiar with the radical Malcolm X, the one who, was always fiery and all this stuff, but they're not quite as familiar with the Malcolm that he became after he came back from his pilgrimage.
Absolutely.
And I think that would be one of the aspects in life that people are more or less familiar with about him that's inspiring.
Yes. I've even seen where his daughters have talked about he was actually a very gentle man, very loving father and husband. And the narrative kind of around Malcolm X is that he was just this militant and he was just very one-dimensional. But, toward the end of his life, after he made the Hajj, he came back and he said that he was willing to work with anybody who was willing to improve the miserable conditions upon this planet, right? So Malcolm changed throughout his life. His character, I guess they would say, was round. He went through the whole thing. So he is very relatable. I think that's one of the things that made him so popular in his charisma. Like, he could speak to the everyday person. And I will add that a lot of what Malcolm teaches, they teach in university now. That was a surprise to me when I started my degree in social justice and human rights, that so many of these talking points are, they're fact, right? Like, we could go into it, but we have a limited amount of time. But he was very accurate about a lot of his talking points, and they remain relevant and accurate today.
He was so accurate in his analysis to the point it was almost frightening. And if you took any time at all to listen to him, it had to get your attention. Now, I suggested that people study his life. I'm saying, like, they've got tapes and recordings out of a lot of Malcolm's speeches now. I'm saying, so you don't have to go read a big old thick book. I don't think the autobiography is on a recording or anything, but I suggest that you would read that as well. But it's a lot of stuff you can learn about Malcolm just listening to his speeches and looking at his interviews on the internet and things of that nature. Get into the man's life, and you will find something that you can relate to and make that part of your life. That is the best way to honor his legacy.
Absolutely. He's played a major role in shaping African-American identity and society. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, one of the things that he did as far as trying to reshape our identity he stopped referring to us as Negroes, and he was the first one that coined that phrase African American. So he used the term Afro American, and it later became African American. And I think that's crucial because the word Negro is a derogatory term, and especially in the context that it was used here in this country. I mean, it's really what it is. It's the Latin version of the word nigger. They both mean the same thing, although we know that nigger means much more in the American dialect than it does in the Latin dialect. You know, in Latin it just means black, and Negro means black. But when you talk about Negro and you talk about black people or niggers here in America, they have a special meaning. A nigger is somebody that's as derogatory as a human being can be. And a Negro is kind of more or less like somebody that what you would call maybe a bootlicker or somebody that's intimidated. He's not going to stand up for anything, and he's going to go along with whatever white folks tell him to do. Malcolm changed that identity, and he told everybody, let's start calling ourselves Afro-Americans.
You know, the speech he gave where he asked, who taught you to hate the color of your skin and your nose and your lips? That speech, that was so powerful. And I can tell you, even my experience meeting my African-American grandmother one of the first times, coming from rural Kansas, I probably had some identity issues being a biracial person. And she hit me with that. And that cleared up my thinking very quickly. So that's just one way his legacy has touched my life. But so many of us, it's really helped us to learn to love ourselves and understand that we are not second-class citizens, and we don't need to be subjected to European beauty standards, right? Like, we have our own intrinsic beauty.
And another thing that always amused me about Malcolm X is, like, we have a lot of people in our race that they're products of biracial marriages and things of this nature. And just, I hear people all the time that tell me, oh, I'm not all black. I'm mixed with this. I'm mixed with that. I go back to this example that Malcolm set when he was in an audience one day and he was being heckled by some black guy that he thought he was really educated and talked real proper and everything. So after Malcolm tried to ignore him, but after he got tired of being heckled, Malcolm took off his glasses. He said, sir, he said, do you know what white people call Afro-Americans who are educated at Harvard and they speak proper English like you do? And he said, the guy said, I happen not to know that. He said, a nigger. And you know, and that phrase became very popular. It was in broad use all the time. People like, you know, man, look, all that other stuff you talking about, you know, they got one definition for you. That's nigger. So it don't matter what you mix with. It don't matter where you've been to school at, what you've been educated, who you've been educated by. They got one definition for you. The word is nigger. So he made a significant contribution in helping us understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. When you're telling that story, it reminds me of that song, The Story of OJ by Jay-Z, where he says, rich nigga, poor nigga, house nigga, field nigga, still nigga.
And yeah, some of us still ain't figured that out until this very day.
Absolutely. A lot of people are very colonized in their mind, and they don't even realize it. I see people still subjecting themselves to European beauty standards, even though I think, like, consciously they understand they don't need to do that. I still see sort of this Eurocentric thinking. So we have to really look at that.
Now, I wanted to add one more thing to the topic we was talking about here just a few minutes ago about Malcolm and the relevance he had to shaping our identity. Malcolm taught us to stop turning to our enemies for solutions to our problems. And everything that has something to do with our liberation and our equality is ultimately dependent upon the good graces of the same people who have had their foot on our necks for years and, you know, have always mistreated us. We still have that problem today. We have to stop thinking that we can turn to our enemies. Now, I'm talking about whether you think you can file a lawsuit in court, whether you think you can march and protest for your civil rights and things of that nature. All these things still involve going back to your slave master and asking him to do right by you, which he is not going to do. He's never done that. You know, and we have to make people understand that if we're going to find a solution to our problems, the solution has to come from us. It's not going to come from them. They're not interested in trying to find a solution. A lot of people conveniently ignore the fact that the civil rights movement only received the attention that it was given because of people like Malcolm X. Back in the 50s and the 60s, people were fed up with the way that they were being treated. And they were to the point where they had started to demand that, look, if we can't have a peaceful solution to our problems, then we'll seek a violent solution to our problems. They came along and they gave the people in the civil rights movement the recognition and the credit and made them see that, look, there is a way that you can get things done. That other way is not going to work. But they did that to try to minimize the threat that the new militancy and the radicalism that was coming up and rising up in this society, to try to minimize the threat that these people could pose. And Malcolm X, he spoke on that and he had told Martin Luther King, he said, look, let me be the bad guy. You go on and keep doing what you're doing, I'll be the bad guy. And I always go back and I reflect on one thing that Malcolm taught on. He said the only way they could make you run to the fox is show you the wolf. So he reversed the strategy on him. He's okay, I'll be the wolf. I'll let Martin Luther King be the fox. And he went on to say, he said the fox and the wolf are both canines. They both belong to the dog family. He said, when you're dealing with them, you take your choice. He said, you can choose a northern dog or a southern dog, but either way, you're still going to end up in the doghouse.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. He also said the ballot or the bullet. Right?
Yeah.
Ballot or the bullet, because we were fed up. I think we're that fed up now, and we just haven't realized it yet.
Yeah, but I don't think we have the same determination that we had back in the 60s. There are so many things out here that we can lose, illusions that we can lose ourselves in, way more than we had back in the 50s and the 60s. Back in the 50s and the 60s, it was liberation. That's all we had. It was either that or keep on living like you living. But now they got a lot. I mean, they look at Clarence Thomas. I mean, they pay you good for being an Uncle Tom now, or being a slave. You know?
Oh, absolutely.
And a lot of people see that as, hey, man, if I can't make my ends meet doing it the other way, I'll do it this way. They'll sell out.
Well, I think that's why Malcolm was a proponent of Black nationalism, right? He wanted us to have our own economic system and political self-determination so we could control our own outcomes for our lives instead of putting the responsibility on somebody else. So we have to certainly recognize also that power only recognizes power. I don't think that we're going to be able to continue to just protest in the streets. Like, I want to talk about briefly the Department of Justice recently in Phoenix. They have decided that there has been a pattern of practice of constitutional and civil rights violations. And one of the things that happened was we had a Trump protest, anti-protest, which I was there, and the police were shooting off tear gas, and it got really bad. But if we can't even exercise our First Amendment rights, what are we supposed to do? If we can't just do that, then we have to think about other options. So I don't advocate for violence, but certainly we have to consider everything. It has to be on the table.
Well,
that's just my personal view.
I follow the example that Malcolm X gave. He said, by any means necessary. We hope it don't have to turn into a situation where it has to be violent, but if violence is the only alternative, then we have to have our freedom. We have to have our liberation no matter what. And you disarm people when you tell them that the violence has to be ruled out no matter what, because that's the very thing that they're going to force you into a situation where you have to make a choice on. All of these things are going to be brought up and discussed at our celebration. We're sending this out to people all across the country. We're going to talk about the ban on Black history being taught in public schools. We're going to talk about ending mass incarceration, abuse and mistreatment of prisoners, which is a nightmare nowadays. Police must stop targeting Black people for murder and violence, and to stop the government's war on the right to protest and the right to freedom of speech, which is what you just spoke on a while ago. I would encourage everybody to try to get together and work with each other. Let's just one time, let's all try to get together and work with each other and make this happen. Let's not only do it here in Kansas City, but let's do it all across the country and let these people see how much we really did appreciate and love what Malcolm X tried to share with us.